Good morning and welcome to Lauterbach and Amon's monthly training. We are getting started with our webinar this morning. We are going to wait just a few minutes to let participants continue to join us. So if you bear with us just a few minutes, we'll kick off here shortly. If you've just joined us this morning, we're just giving a couple more minutes for people to hop on with us. We will be launching here in just a few moments if you can bear with us. Thank you. All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started this morning. Just a couple of housekeeping items, so hopefully others can join us in this first few minutes. My name is Jamie Wilkie. I'm one of the partners here at Lauterbach and Amon, and we certainly thank you for taking the time to join us this morning. Just a couple of housekeeping items as we get started. We will, in fact, be taking questions throughout the presentation. I will be acting as moderator and kind of monitoring those questions. So we do ask that you please use the Q&A function towards the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen. And we will, again, periodically be kind of stopping presentation as it's warranted to answer those. First question we've already gotten this morning is obtaining copies of the presentation. It will, in fact, be sent out to all of you immediately after the presentation. You'll have copies. It will also be posted to the Lauterbach and Amon website under the news section of our website. I am joined this morning by a number of professional colleagues and experts on our subject matter today. So first off, I'd like to just give brief introductions, and then I'll be handing things over to AJ Weber on the Lauterbach and Amon team. AJ Weber has been with Lauterbach and Amon since 2012. And serves as a director in our pension fund team. Todd Schroeder is also joining us today, also a member of the Lauterbach and Amon team. Todd has been with the firm since 2011 and serves as the director of our actuarial services. We're also joined this morning by Jim Schneider with Ice Miller. Jim is head of the Illinois Municipal Finance Group of Ice Miller, a law firm that has been acting as bond counsel in the Midwest for many decades. He acts as bond counsel and disclosure counsel to hundreds of government entities throughout the state of Illinois, including cities, villages, school districts, counties, park districts, and other special districts, and as underwriters counsel to dozens of municipal bond underwriters. Jim regularly serves clients on municipal finance transactions, including issuers of GO bonds, revenue bonds, special service area bonds, tax increment financing bonds, and industrial development revenue bonds, as well as multifamily housing bonds and Section 501c3 or nonprofit revenue bonds. And Jim is often a frequent speaker on public finance issues. So we certainly want to welcome Jim to our webinar this morning, and certainly grateful to have his expertise with us as well. Last but certainly not least, I would like to introduce Stefan Roberts. Stefan joins us as director with Baird's public finance team. He's been with them since 1998. And since then, he's provided issuers, both large and small, with leadership and investment banking expertise. He provides services to such clients as the cities of Danville, Freeport, Moline, Rochelle, Rock Island, and Rockford, and the counties of Rock Island and Winnebago, and villages as well, such as Antioch, Glen Ellen, Midlothian, New Lenox, and Tinley Park. He brings innovative ideas to his clients' unique needs and provides the same level of service to all clients. Testament to his skills was his participation in the Bond Buyers Midwest Regional Deal of the Year Award in 2005 on a complicated pension transaction, and non-traditional deal of the year in 2009, assisting a client with a swap counterparty negotiation. Sounds complicated, Stefan. Another of his clients, again, won the award in 2011 for National Small Issue Deal of the Year. He is a graduate of North Central College here in Naperville, where he graduated in finance. He is licensed through FINRA as a general municipal securities representative and principal, is registered through the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board as municipal advisor and principal, and a uniform securities agent. So certainly I would also like to welcome his expertise to the panel this morning. Our agenda this morning is really a twofold topic. First, I will be handing the reins over to AJ Weber on our pension team to really give an update on where the police and fire consolidation process is at. I know there's quite a bit of buzz out in the industry of kind of where we are and what's left, and you know, what the future looks like for that process. So he's going to thrill us with those updates this morning. And then we will kind of turn it over into what I would call a hot topic these days. I know we've gotten several phone calls through our office, as I know Ice Miller and Baird have both equally been kind of fielding phone calls related to pension obligation bonds. And so the goal this morning will be, you know, what are they, how do they work, what's the impact, what are risks, kind of what's the legal side of that transaction as well. So I am going to turn things over to AJ. You guys are in great hands this morning. And as I said, please submit questions throughout the morning through our Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So AJ, I'm gonna lead it off with you.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. So I've been asked to give kind of a brief high-level overview of each of the representative pension investment fund boards, where they're kind of at from operational standpoint, and kind of what to expect in 2021. So first, we'll start with the Police Officers Pension Investment Fund. They created and had their permanent board elections earlier this year. And kind of as a reminder, this permanent board is comprised of 3 representatives representing municipalities, 3 members representing the active participant population or your current police officers. You have 2 members representing beneficiaries, and then 1 member representing the Illinois Municipal League. So you can see the list of board members there on the slide. Sean Curry of Peoria Police is the chairperson, and Daniel Hopkins, a retiree from Collinsville Police, is the vice chairperson. And Elizabeth Hall, the director of finance and IT for Lake Forest, actually serves as the board's treasurer. So over the course, since the board has been in its inception, I've created several committees. Jamie, you can go to the next slide for me, to aid in the decision-making process. Between committee meetings and full board meetings, the organization actually held nearly 40 meetings in 2020, and they continue to meet on a regular basis. Now remember, these are all public meetings. You can actually find a list of their current meetings on their temporary website. The website's listed on that page right there. The fund is also building out a little bit more robust website, and they expect to launch that sometime during 2021. So the police fund currently has a dedicated staff of one member, which is Executive Director Richard White. Mr. White is actually a former law enforcement officer himself. He was previously the retirement administrator for the Mendocino County Employees Retirement Association, among other civic duties that he has held. The board is currently interviewing a chief investment officer position candidates. They expect to make a recommendation with this month for that position and continue to build out their staff in the rest of 2021. So the board has leveraged the use of several outsourced service providers to help with several aspects of the fund's operations and setup. So we at Lauterbach and Naaman were engaged for accounting, payroll, and some interim CFO services. Foster and Foster was engaged to be the board's administrator. Baker Tilly was the auditor for the last fiscal year. Survey and ballot systems conducted the permanent board elections. The board utilizes the service of a group called Vision MAI as their government liaison, and they have engaged 2 law firms to help with all legal aspects of the organization, and those include Reamer, Dobrovoni, and Lombardi PC, as well as Jacob Burns or Love Hernandez and LLP. And then lastly, the board recently engaged Adirondack Investment Advisors as their transition consultant to help them through the actual transition of assets. So the executive director, as well as the board, have a number of initiatives in place for 2021. And this is by no means a comprehensive list, but points to a few of the priorities for 2021, including the retention of additional staff, continuing to build out the framework for the actual transition of assets, identifying appropriate procedures for the certified asset list, which is part of that transition process and the statutorily required part of that process, finalizing their website, and determining financial statement reporting requirements. Now on to the fire side. So much like their police brethren, they had their permanent board elections earlier this year. The composition of the board is made up slightly differently than it is police. They have 3 members representing by either municipalities or fire protection district, 3 members from the active member population, 1 beneficiary member, 1 member from the Illinois Municipal League, and then 1 member recommended by the Associated Firefighters of Illinois, or AFFI. So Chuck Sullivan is the board's chair. He represents AFFI as well as Champaign Fire. Brad Cole from the IML is actually the vice chair, and Jeff Roritz, the deputy village manager and CFO of Northbrook, serves as the board's treasurer. So the Firefighters Pension Investment Fund has also been very busy. They've had several committees help drive the decision-making process and make recommendations to the full board. You can find quite a bit of information on the fund's website, ifpif.org, including upcoming committee and board trustee meeting dates, minutes, agendas, communications. Friday, they will actually hold a full board of trustees meeting at 9 a.m. where the audit and compliance committee will make the recommendation on the transition plan. So kind of a big step for the fire fund is to be discussed on Friday. The Firefighters Pension Investment Fund has 4 in-house staff members at this point. William Atwood, formerly the Illinois State Board of Investment, serves as the board's executive director. He previously held that position at the State Board of Investment. David Zaloga serves as the CFO, Steve Zahn as the COO, and Mitchell Green rounds out the current staff as the portfolio officer. IFPIF has also engaged some local service providers as well to help service the needs. So LNA, we've been working with accounting and administration, Sikich for audit services, survey and ballot, just like police conducted the elections for the permanent board. They've selected Marquette and Associates as their investment consultant and Ernst & Young as their transition consultant. I can tell you those 2 groups have been hard at work for some time, developing the transition plan, which will include the recommendation to the board on Friday. And then the board's legal counsel is comprised of Mayor Brown as well as Jacob Burns, Orlov, and Hernandez. So IFPIF has a similar set of initiatives for 2021, including finalizing the transition plan of assets and hire a custodian for those assets. And I know they are close to that decision-making process as we speak. After determining the transition plan for procedures, determining how we're going to conduct the certified asset list process that will be drafted, and also determining the financial statement reporting requirements for the fund. Lastly, the board and staff will continue to communicate with local boards on the timing and progress of their efforts. I believe at this point, most local pension boards have probably been contacted by a member of the FPIF team. really just to provide a basic point of contact at the organization. So when we do go through the transition of assets, if PIF has a direct line to the local boards, and I believe they will continue to make sure they do reach out and calls to make sure everybody is on the same page. So I'm happy to answer any questions that I can towards the end or now if Jamie sees fit, but if nothing else, I'll hand it over to Jim to start the bond discussion.
So I do have one question that's come in. The question, and I think it's a good one because I've heard it many times, will actuarial services be performed by the new funds and then when? So I don't know if Todd, maybe you want to jump in and briefly answer this one, or AJ, I'm sure you know the answer too, but.
So it's a great question. And yes, actuary services are a part of the statutory requirements. I don't think that actuary services at this point has been discussed to my knowledge, as the focus has seemed to be making sure the framework for the transition of assets is front and center. So like many other the questions regarding the consolidation, yet to be determined exactly what that's going to look like. And Todd, feel free to add a piece if you think you have better insight.
I would agree. I think that certainly actuary services are going to be provided to the two pension boards, but the timing, I think, is still to be decided.
And so I think just to clarify that, the local funds really are still, in theory, responsible for engaging those actuarial services in the near future. We don't really have an end date to that process.
Correct. Until the local boards hear differently, it's still at the local board or local municipal fire protection district to make sure those services are acquired directly.
Great. Those are all the questions thus far. So if anybody else wants to submit, we will certainly address them at the end of the presentation as well. All right, so I think we're shifting into our pension obligation bond discussion. So gentlemen, I'll let you take that away.
Great. This is Jim Snyder. I'm a bond lawyer at Ice Miller. We've been bond counsel for many, many years. And last year, or recent, rates are so good that's been, we've been very busy. Not just pension bonds, we've done a number of those, but just a lot of refinancing issues. So rates are really at historic lows. And so that's why, what are pension obligation bonds? They're really just refinancing of current obligations. So you already have, theoretically, they could be done to pay current obligations, and I guess that'd be a pension obligation bonds. But the ones we've worked on and the ones that are we advise clients to consider are the ones that refinance an existing obligation. You already have an unfunded liability. You pay, typically to IMRF. It's typically at a higher interest rate, and the interest rates on bonds are, as I mentioned, really low. So we have a lot of clients taking advantage of it. It seems to me everybody should consider it. I can't imagine somebody just saying we're not interested at all. Pension bonds are basically used to pay all or portion of the liability. Basically, what you do is you take the proceeds of the bonds and invest them with other system assets. The bonds are generally required to be issued at taxable rates and amortize over the same term as the existing unfunded pension liability. So the primary risk to the issuer in issuing it is to issuing bonds to pay an unfunded liability is a risk that the interest accruing on the bonds will exceed the investment return on the bond proceeds. And obviously with rate, the lower the rates are, the lower that risk is. And so rates are they're particularly attractive when it's significantly less than the actuarial rate on the unfunded liability. And Stefan and Todd will get into this in further detail, some of the nuances of that. Unlike a refunding issue, the savings is not fixed because, the simplest example is I have a home mortgage, right? I have my rates X, rates are historical low. A couple months ago, I refinanced it. I could tell you what my savings are. It's just like most refunding issues that we issue. The underwriter tells us, we'll do a number run. Here's the savings, and you have that. It's instead, as Stefan will go through, it's more projections. You have to make some assumptions. But again, as long as the earnings are greater than the bond rate, then it's going to result in a win. Basically, the bond rate becomes the new hurdle rate for investment earnings, and to do that, we'll look at the history to determine and make the assumptions. Next slide, please. So, as the bond lawyer, our job is to handle the legal issues, and the most important one is how do you get legal authority to do this? Well, if you're a home rule unit, you have authority by the Illinois Constitution. If you're not a home rule unit, you'd require a referendum, which is it's pretty rare to do that. You can, and the bottom line is that bonds would be secured by the tax levy, but it could be abated each year using the existing pension levy. So, most, at least with respect to municipalities, they already have a pension levy. The idea is not to increase that levy. The idea is to decrease that levy and make it over time. The most common structure we use is alternate revenue bonds, which are GO bonds that are secured by a revenue source and requires a backdoor referendum procedure and coverage requirements. The most common revenue pledge is their existing pension levy. So you have a pension levy now that's imposed, and then that's used to pay the existing current obligations plus the unfunded obligation. And the idea is we're going to keep that levy in place, pledge that to the bonds, and do a bond issue to save, with the idea of saving money for the issuer. And then the unlimited property levies pledged in the event that for some reason the revenue source wasn't enough. So basically that gets you the lower rate to really help with this. Then another type of obligation that would work, and we've done these, is debt certificates. What a debt certificate is basically an obligation of the issuer to pay from whatever source they have. There's not a tax levy, so the rate is higher, but what issuers would typically do is they'd still use the existing pension levy. Okay, next slide, please. So these are typically issued as taxable obligations, and the reason is it's really difficult to use it to finance working capital obligations. So if a client came to me and said, I want to issue a bond and pay off current operations, it's hard to do that longer term, which of course the benefit of this is doing it longer term. So pension bonds theoretically you could go through those rules and get it done. But as a practical matter, most people, when we have that conversation, they say, geez, with all the restrictions that we're going to put on it and the rates right now are so low for taxable, it's not that big a difference. We tend not to have as much of those discussions, but I want to put that out there because that question will come up. Okay, and now I'm going to transfer it to Todd.
Excellent. Thank you, Jim. As we go through this process, and There are, from an employer standpoint, there's a lot of service providers and a lot of folks you should be talking to. Certainly, we just heard some of the legal information as part of this process. And unfortunately, the actuary is somebody you should talk to as well. So we're going to get into some of the actuarial considerations in this portion, in this section. When you're talking to the actuary about this process, you're really talking about and focused on costs on the pension fund side of the process. So we will later on get to the costs on the employer, the bond side of the process as well, but we're going to start with the pension fund and start discussing some of those costs. And ultimately, what it boils down to from the pension fund side is we're going to try to compare what your unfunded liability is today and what it's costing in the pension fund to pay off that unfunded liability over time. So a couple of things when it comes to unfunded liability. One, that is the focus of this process in most cases. We're trying to look at a way to more efficiently pay down our unfunded liability over time. We're not necessarily looking to pay the normal cost, which is the annual operating cost of the pension fund as part of this process. So we would expect if your unfunded liability were paid off, if you're 100% funded, that you're going to still have an annual operating cost that is your normal cost on a going forward basis that would be anticipated. Unfunded liability is important to certainly focus on. In many cases, we see the payment towards unfunded liability on an annual basis is higher than the annual operating cost. So it's 50 to 75% of the payment. And in many cases, it's closer to that 75%. So it is a significant portion of the cost structure when we look at funding our pensions over time. When we're paying down unfunded liability, we are expecting those payments in most cases to increase over time. So that's another piece of this process to consider when we're looking at unfunded liability. It's not just the level of unfunded liability, but it's the pattern of payoff over time and how that affects our budgets, not only today, but in the future when it comes to paying off unfunded liability. So that's something else we'll take a look at as we get through this presentation. One other piece, and this is a piece we're going to focus a little more on, is unfunded liability has an interest charge to it. And when you hear about this process on a high level, for folks who've heard about this process in the past, they've heard about it's the interest game on that. So we're going to take a moment here as we get into the next slide and talk about where that interest cost comes from as part of this process. Because I think I think that's one of the more misunderstood concepts is interest on pension debt within the pension fund. So when we look at, from an actuarial perspective, pension fund liability, we're really looking at dollars we want to use to pay future benefits. And the easiest person to look at is a retiree in this perspective to start to understand some of the concepts between being fully funded and actually paying future benefits in the pension fund. Because when an actuary comes in and says you have a liability for future benefit payments, it's not that we expect those dollars to be the only ones used to pay those future benefit payments. It's really those dollars and the investment earnings on those dollars to pay future benefits as part of this process. So again, if we look at a retiree, we can get a real simple example of this. And on this slide, we kind of lay that out. If we have a retired member who's 60 years old and married with a monthly benefit of $1,000, under some reasonable or standard actuarial assumptions, you might see the actuary come in and tell you that your liability for that retiree is $200,000. Now, what that means is if you have $200,000 in your pension fund today, we're not expecting that the employer is going to have to come up with any more money in the future to pay future benefits. Now, if you dig a little deeper into the actuarial results, you'll see that the expected future benefit payments to be made for this member and this member's spouse is around $600,000. So you start to compare the $200,000 to the $600,000, and that's where the interest component comes into play as part of this process. If you have $200,000 today, we're expecting over time that those dollars are going to earn $400,000 of interest during this member's lifetime as they're receiving their retirement benefit. And that $400,000 is going to be used as part of the payment for this member's future benefit in this process. So $600,000 in total payments to be made, $200,000 funded today, $400,000 from interest coming in the future. When you look at the employer's future cost for this member, then it's really dependent on how well funded this member's benefit is as part of this process. If you have a plan that's 100% funded, as I mentioned before, you have 200,000 in the pension fund. The investment earnings are going to take care of the rest, and we don't expect any future employer costs for this member as part of this process. On the flip side, if your pension fund is 0% funded as part of this process, the employer now needs to come up with a full $600,000 worth of payments in the future and fund that in order to make the payments to this member during their retirement period. And if you look at a common example, we do see a lot of pension funds in that 40 to 60% funded range. So if you look at a fund that was 50% funded, the employer is going to need to come up with $300,000 in the future to make these future benefit payments. Part of that is to make up for the unfunded liability today, which is $100,000. But the other piece that the employer has to come up with is $200,000 in lost investment earnings over time. So as you have an unfunded liability, and as time progresses through this member's retirement period, the expected investment earnings that were supposed to come in as part of this process are being shifted on an annual basis to the employer as an employer cost. So over time, for this member, again, of that $300,000 in future cost, $100,000 is for today's unfunded liability, but $200,000 is really this shift over time in expected investment earnings becoming an employer contribution obligation. So if we take that on this next slide, if we take that individual member and we expand that to a fuller macro view of what it means in the pension funding process as future expected investment earnings are shifted to an employer cost, we can look at a fund, let's say, that has $20 million of unfunded liability. So again, in the big picture, what does that mean from an employer standpoint? A common way to pay that off, and a common way that many employers and pension funds are paying that off, is over a 20-year period using a payment that increases at 3.5% per year. And for this example, we're going to use investment earnings expectation at 6.75%. So if we look at the next slide, gives us some of our macro results from this example. Over the course of the next 20 years, without any other assistance, to pay off this $20 million in unfunded liability we have today, it's going to cost about almost $40 million, $39.9 million to pay off that unfunded liability over the 20-year period. So in 20 years, when we wake up, we'll have our $20 million of unfunded liability that existed today will go away. But also over that 20-year period, we have $19.9 million in what was expected investment earnings that are now shifting into the employer and the taxpayer contribution bucket. So as you start to think about this process and you start to think about pension bonds and the cost of debt and making a comparison, this is really our bogey. This $19.9 million in investment earnings that shifted to an employer contribution over time becomes our bogey for comparison over a period of time. So there's really two things as you go through the pension bond process that you would look to do as you're assessing this $19.9 million. One, is there an alternative out there that is cheaper than the $19.9 million and that provides us significant enough cost savings to take on any additional risks that might exist as part of this process? And two, can we better manage the payoff pattern over this 20-year period of time through the use of an alternative source of funding? And most notably, if you look back at the top of the slide there, we are expecting the payment towards unfunded liability, again, to increase over time, which is pretty common. At the end of the 20-year period, that payment is almost double where it started at the beginning of the 20-year period. So that would be really the second thing as you start considering alternative ways to manage this unfunded liability. Those are two things you want to look at and consider as part of this process. So before we get to the other side of the equation and give you a look at what some alternatives might look like, just a couple thoughts, a couple considerations. one, when you look at the pension funding process, whether you issue bonds and put money in your pension fund, or you don't issue bonds and you continue to manage your pension fund the way it is, volatility exists. And there's nothing about anything in this process that makes that volatility on the pension side go away. So you'll still have asset volatility. You still have volatility related to your liabilities and how well are you meeting your actuarial assumptions in terms of when people are retiring and things like that over this period of time. So that stuff will still exist whether or not you enter into this process. So over the long term, hopefully you're going to get close to meeting your assumptions both on the investment side and on the liability side. But in the short term, you could see some volatility. So if you start this process today, the first year in the markets is a down year in the markets. You could certainly have pension costs that exist with your bond issuance and also within the pension fund for unfunded liability in the short term in this process. Other things to consider, certainly this cost does not go away still. There still is a pension cost in the future. That's the normal cost that I mentioned earlier, or the annual operating cost as part of this process. As I mentioned, if the unfunded liability does pop up, and it can pop up over time, there's still an obligation to pay down any new unfunded liability that could come up in year 2, 3, 4 of this process. Again, whether you issue bonds or don't issue bonds, that would still exist. And you want to make sure you understand the impact on your financial statements. As an employer, you want to make sure you understand how the rating agencies will view this, and we'll get into a little more detail later in the presentation on that. But those are other things you want to consider as part of this process. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to Stefan, and he's going to start talking about the other side of the equation, which is the bond side.
Thanks, Todd. So I should start out, I've been doing POBs for 20 years. And, I've been doing them in other states, and until recently, they really haven't caught on in the state of Illinois. You saw pension holidays, you saw not a lot of interest because they saw POBs as hard liabilities versus, funding or underfunding underfunding what Todd was just talking about. So you really didn't see a lot of interest until last year. Jim kind of alluded to this. Low taxable interest rate in the year below 1%, was below that before. And then you saw, expectations of returns that made POBs attractive. So what Todd went through is we have an issue. The issue is how you're paying currently. Most likely, you're going to see an increase in your cost. For this example, we took Village X. And basically, you're seeing payments increase from Todd's example from 1.3 million to 2.5. So the question always is for communities, how are we going to pay that? So what are POBs? Jim did a great job explaining, but they're arbitrary. They're basically borrowing in the taxable market and putting the money into the pension funds and earning hopefully more than the bond yield, taxable bond yield on the POBs. So potentially it can save a lot of money versus how you're currently doing it. In this example, we're estimating 10.3 million in interest savings over 20 years. How is that generated? Is we are estimating Village X can borrow at a taxable average yield of 2.7%. And in the example, the assumed in the pension funds is 6 3/4, 6.75. So as Jim said, let's first look at this as like a mortgage refi. Let's look at this as a typical bond refunding. That differential in interest rates generates that 10.3 million in savings. There's another issue that we'll explore in the next few pages. As you see that, as I said, that increasing arc, I call it the ski slope, from 1.3 million to 2.5. You have the ability with POBs to fix that with structuring alternatives. So next page, we'll kind of explore a little bit here. So the first solution we explored is what you see on a typical bond refunding is a level savings solution. And just to go through these charts, you can see the third column from the left, the annual payment to amortize. That's simply from Lauterbach and Amen, the 1.3 million to 2.5 is that upward sloping curve. Then what's another way you could possibly fund this is to do a taxable POB, and that's under that blue box, the alternate funding method, level savings illustration. So you can see the principal, the interest at 2.7, and then you see total debt service, the 802,000, all the way down to 2040 of the $2 million. And when you compare those two columns, annual payment, the 1.3 down to 2.5 to the taxable debt service, you can see that level savings solution right around our estimates are 520,000 annually. Gross savings of 10.3, present value, and that's in the gray box below, is basically you take that cash flow and discount it at the bond yield, 2.7, and you can see PV savings of 8.2 or $8.2 million and 41%. So let me just go a little bit into what that 41% means. Is basically taking the total PV savings, the 8.2, and dividing it by the refunded liability, and you get a percentage. On a typical bond refunding, you see 3%. But on this one, it's at 41. And I will argue, as you'll see later, you want to see those high savings figures. So next page is what I call kind of the bunny slope, but the ski slope. As you can see, the top line is basically what Village X would pay from 2020 all the way out to 2039. And then, as I mentioned before, the first structure's level savings is basically that aqua color. And you can see the savings, and then the gray is the debt service on the taxable. So of all the pension deals that I've done, I've never had a client say, I want that structure. And it's pretty obvious what the problem is you haven't fixed that upward sloping line. Basically, debt service is increasing. So a lot of our CFOs or finance directors say, well, we don't want to do this. We want to see a little more conservative structure, and that's on the next page. It's actually the easiest from a bond structuring, but it's also the most conservative. Rating agencies prefer to see the structure. And it simply is not level savings, but level debt service. And you'll see, I'll show you the chart. So a POB, as I mentioned before, allows you to have structuring flexibility and to fix the issue. And that is with this level savings solution. And you can see in the bottom, by foregoing the early savings, Village X is able to increase, because you're actually amortizing principal faster, you're able to increase the savings by, in this example, $1.25 million than the level savings solution. So let's see what that looks like in a chart. I already said the increased savings, you lower your interest rate by 0.11. That's because you're amortizing principal faster. You can see the average from the 2.7 is now 2.59%. And you can see the same column as that annual payment to amortize is the 1.3 to 2.5. We didn't change anything in this example. The only thing changed is the structure of the taxable bond issue. And you can see in the net total debt service, we've structured debt service 1.2 million every year. And that generates a different savings pattern. You can see in this example, we have 36,000 in the first year, and it ramps up annually to get to 1.2 million in fiscal year 2040. That generates aggregate debt service of $11.7 million, PV of 8.5, or 42.7%. As you can see, potential savings is higher by 1.4 roughly million dollars. And the next slide will demonstrate why we're doing this. So as you saw in the first solution, we were tracking the payment to amortize your unfunded, but here we leveled it off. And I did, large county deals. I've done fire protection districts. I've done cities and villages, and I can't think of one example that haven't picked this as their solution, because you're actually fixing the problem with level debt service. And as I'll get, or Todd will get into later, rating agencies like to see this, because what they don't want to see, the red flag, is first, you financing your normal costs, that's seen as budgetary relief. And two, they don't want to see savings up front, especially in 4-year cycles that seem to be tied to a political cycle. They like to see you fix the problem and delay savings until at the end, which will give you a little more leeway year to year. So in this example, we were thinking about a bond refunding, but we really have to talk about the benefits, the risk, public perception. I encourage all my clients to Google POBs. You're sitting in the state, city of Chicago, consider doing 10 billion. The state of Illinois did, I think it was 10 billion back in, I'm gonna get the year wrong, but they did it 20 years ago, 15 years ago, but they actually did do some budgetary relief. So there is press out there that we encourage you to read and understand before moving forward on this concept. But I'm going to take the first two. I'm going to take benefits and risk and start out with the benefits, which are manifest. Next slide is, it potentially generates a lot of savings versus how you're currently doing it. We already went through the savings of it, but it's basically, just to reiterate, replacing the 6 3/4 with a lower taxable bond yield. We've already talked about Village X has the flexibility to structure it in whatever way they would like, and they have the ability to fix the problem, which is to do level debt service. I've had some cities and villages say, well, as I said before, this is a soft liability, funding pensions, and I would argue they're less of a soft liability because you have to be 90% funded by 2040, but you do have to pay taxable bond debt service. So that is a hard liability that you would have to pay every 6 months on interest and principal once a year. Jim touched on the hurdle rate. It basically takes 6 3/4 down to the estimated 2.7 in today's market. And you're able to become immediately funded. I should mention you can become 100% funded, what we assumed in this example, but you can do a lesser amount. You could go to 90. You could make this a part of a complete package of fixing the issue, and bonds could be just one portion of it, or you can decide to do it all and become 100% funded at closing. One thing we do throw in on the next slide is that you're able, for smaller issuers out there, to raise your asset base, and under 10 million, you're restricted in what you can invest in. And we've seen examples where a POB can add to the asset base, and you're able to invest in a different mix. For example, we have in here 45% equities, or actually we have 2 equities. So you could have more of an equity balance versus fixed income if you exceed $10 million. And I won't even, the next one is on consolidation that we've already dealt with, but these restrictions can be lifted potentially with consolidation. And last bullet, immediately reduces or eliminates the current unfunded pension plan. We've already gone through that. The risk on the next slide are what I spend my clients most of the time on. So when you Google POBs, when you start to look at the press out there, what are you going to read? The first and most important risk is the first one. We thought of this like a bond refunding, like a mortgage refi, but it has additional risk. And the biggest risk is if you earn below the average yield of 2.7% of the life of the transaction, you will lose money and you shouldn't have done it. Full stop. If you have the expectation that you will earn exactly 2.7, I'd be the first to tell you you shouldn't have done this transaction because you're going to break even, but you're going to have to pay cost of issuance and other expenses. So let's skip up. If our assumption assume you earn the 6.75, the rate, and if you were able to do that over the life of the transaction, your expected savings will be as we presented. If you earn more than that, you'll have more savings. If you earn between the 2.7 and the 6.75, you'll have savings, but it will be less than we presented today. So we encourage you to, look back, even include the 08, 09 years, just to look at what your average returns are, and then you can make an assessment whether, SEC will come in this office right now if I told you that guarantees future results, but at least gives you a rough barometer of your historic returns and whether this idea could make sense for you. Consolidation, again, the whole thought, a lot of counties do this because they're under the IMRF system, and IMRF has had some stellar returns. If you look at any time period, they've pretty much been above 7.3%. So the whole thought process behind consolidation is having an IMRF type system where you're going to see these returns. I'm going to go through some other potential risks. This is more for the city and villages. If you do 100% of this, you're going to receive at closing a pretty large amount of money. And if you were to put it in the market, you could be at risk. Let's just say the market didn't, the first year, the second year didn't perform. That would put you in an immediate negative position, and that is a risk. Some of our other clients have decided to periodically put in money. They kept it out and they funded up the system as they've gone along. They must, this is the second one, POB proceeds must be turned over to the systems. I had a client that was exploring this and they wanted to keep it out of the systems, but the problem is it does not defease a liability. So you still have that liability on the books, but you have an offsetting asset. But POB proceeds, the whole point of this, need to go into the systems, and they need to be a part of it, become part of the asset base. We've already talked about POBs are hard liabilities versus soft liabilities. So I'm arguing that pension funding is now a little more hard, and but taxable bond issues you do have to pay that. So I don't know if there's questions, because I went through this relatively quickly, but if not, I'll turn it over to Todd.
I do have one question that's come in. I think it's a good one, probably to clarify a bit. So the question says, obviously under the risk category of discussion, we have consolidation noted as possibly generating higher returns in the future versus what we've seen historically in the past. Wouldn't this be a benefit and not necessarily a risk? So I don't know if anybody on the panel here wants to kind of speak to, I think we put it under the category of risk for a specific reason. And part of it, in my opinion, is just kind of the yet unknown of what the future investment framework is going to look like for the consolidated funds. We know what current state statute is. We don't quite have a clear picture of what the consolidated type of investment matrix is going to look like. So I'm not sure if anybody else has feedback on that question.
Well, I'll just say one thing before I'm sure your representatives, Lauterbach, can jump in here, but I was, I'll say this one client, I got my hand slapped a little bit because I'm ambivalent. The whole thought behind consolidation is to get IMRF and a professional managed fund. But, I know there's a lot of thought of, is it a good thing or a bad thing? Does it increase? I don't know. It's not my area of expertise, but I do know the thought process is you would see better returns, lower cost structure, and you would see a large, like when you buy into IMRF, you're buying into a $45 billion portfolio. So you don't have those ups and downs that you'll see if it's just community X investing into their own. You're buying a proportionate share of that portfolio. So I'll shut up now, but that's the thought process that I believe they're looking at. But Don, AJ, anything to add?
I'll just add, I think with consolidation, I think Stefan nailed the main risk on the head. The idea of the future returns being expected to be higher doesn't necessarily get rid of the year-to-year volatility that comes with investing in the markets in general. So there's still going to be the annual volatility. It's expected with these new pension funds that they're going to have more flexibility to react to some of that. But I would be surprised if they came out and said that they've solved volatility, because nobody has really done that over time. So the annual volatility still exists. The risk that really gets mitigated is the market timing risk. And Stefan alluded to this. If you are in a community right now with your current pension fund and you have 10 million in assets, and then tomorrow you put $10 million more in, you're doing market timing with quite a big portion of your fund, and some of that gets mitigated as the funds get consolidated. So I would say certainly that part of the risk is reduced, but the general market risk still exists out there.
Thank you. I think we're ready to shift to the next slide then.
All right, and I'm going to jump to 38, the next slide. I think that 37 covers a lot of the risk pieces I talked about earlier in this process. We have two quick ones here on different viewpoints with respect to pension obligation bonds that we wanted to cover and certainly give you a picture of. And one is the rating agencies, and they've been talked about in several sections in this process. But the rating agencies are somebody you should talk to, and somebody that should be brought into the front end of this process and into these discussions as you're reviewing this decision potentially to go down this path. Generally, rating agencies, as long as you're pulling in the right people and structuring it the right way, they're generally going to state that they're neutral in this process in the way they view these things, but they will look for it to be structured a certain way in order to say that. They'll include these bonds when they do their ratings as bonds, and as they would in any of your other bonds in that process. S&P has actually provided, and we gave you a list here, has provided a few things more specific that they look for, and things specifically that they would see that would cause them to create a comment that says this is a negative for your financial statements. First thing was if your bonds are being used to pay your annual costs. So if you were borrowing to pay your normal cost as part of this process, and then as a couple of people have mentioned earlier, I think both Jim and Stefan have mentioned this would be considered budgetary relief, and they would look at that from a negative viewpoint. If your issuance isn't combined with a specific plan in terms of addressing the liability, they would view this as a negative as part of this process. And if the bonds come in and reduce your ability to issue bonds to do other things in the future in some substantial manner, then they would look at that as a negative in the process as well. So a lot of this is about how it's structured and what the bonds are being used for. So I think getting that picture and getting a clear message to the rating agencies upfront as to what the plan is an important piece of this process. On the next slide, there's one other viewpoint we wanted to share with everybody, and it's the GFOA recommendation. And the Government Finance Officers Association does recommend against pension bonds as part of the issues that they review and that they release to folks as part of this process. And it's a pretty interesting, as you look through the GFOA recommendations. I won't read all of it to you. It's on the slide here, certainly, but the GFOA piece is actually pretty well written, and it's not necessarily the broad conclusion isn't necessarily something I would promote in terms of individual communities looking and making their own assessment as to part of this. But as you look through the GFOA recommendations, it provides some interesting guidelines that I think would be important to any employer who's considering this process. For one, they're covering the idea of the financial risks, and we've talked about that in a few spots now on this. But will bonds or will the bond proceeds in the pension fund earn more money than the bonds will cost you over time? That's one of the things GFOA has as a question on there. So they're addressing the financial risks, and that's an important thing certainly for employers to address as they're assessing this process. The other points that they make are really structural concerns and how the bond issuance is set up. So it's giving employers a guideline in a sense as to what they should look for in the structure of these bonds to mitigate the concerns that GFOA lists out in here. So things like incorporating complex instruments is a point that GFOA makes as part of this process. Overall debt limits is another point they talk about on this page in this process. The payoff period for the bond. So if you have a 20-year amortization in the pension fund and you get a bond that's going to be paid off over 50 years, they don't like that concept. So structuring your payoff period in a more appropriate fashion would help alleviate certainly part of that concern. And then the rating agency view was the final piece GFOA mentions. And so again, that's one that can be mitigated by talking to the rating agencies ahead of time, giving them a workup of what your structure looks like and what you want to do with it, and getting some feedback from them in the front end of the process rather than after the fact. And with that, I'm going to kick it back over to Jim to talk real quick on the public perception of pension obligation bonds.
Thanks, Todd. Yeah, from a general perspective, the public perception of pension obligation bonds is negative. But it really depends on who you talk to. The articles you Google, you're going to see more bad articles than you're going to see good articles. But as Todd just mentioned, you went through the criticism of IGFOA of pension obligation bonds. Well, the risks and the problems can be mitigated. Don't finance short term. Don't do anything, that is crazy or, aggressive. Basically, you have an obligation and the obligation exists. And what a lot of times the news media, it'll come in, it'll kind of just, you're issuing pension obligation bonds is creating more of the same problem that got you in trouble in the first place. And that's unfair. First of all, the way I think people need to look at it is you have an obligation, however you got there, you're there. Here's your obligation. Now what should you do? If you do a pension obligation bond, somebody's going to criticize you, but an informed person would go down the road, look at it, do the analysis, understand the risks, and then go, make that analysis. It's just ironic. Nobody criticized me for refinancing my home mortgage. Nobody. And, but pension obligation bonds, it gets coupled with, years ago, there's some communities that borrowed to finance operations or did synthetic, creative, complex instruments that, ended up being problematic. We're not talking about any of that. We're just talking about having existing obligation, and we want to, we suggest that given where the rates are, just to refinance it with lower financing costs. That is I'm a lawyer, I'm not a finance, but it just strikes me as a lot of our clients are looking at that as a reasonable consideration. I will tell you, it seems to me that it's shifted from pretty much everybody's considering it. It used to be as soon as you'd bring it up, some people would say, well, I read that article and it's bad. I would argue nothing's really changed, although the numbers are better. But there is a movement to look at least examine it, and that's all. Ultimately the decision would be it's on the issuer. What's and perception is very relevant. I'm not saying it's not relevant, but there's plenty of information and facts as you dig into this that you could arm if you do decide to do one, that you could say, here's what we're doing it. And again, I would encourage to just look at the guy who refinances his home mortgage, because it's actually perhaps less risky to do nothing sometimes. With that, I think I'll turn it over to Jamie to wrap up and see if we have any other questions.
Sure, thank you. So yes, I'll let people, if there's any additional questions, to come in. Again, if you can use that Q&A function. Just kind of housekeeping items to wrap up. We will, as I said at the start of this, be providing the presentation to all of the attendees after today's session. It'll also be posted on the Lauterbach and Eamon website under our news section as well. So certainly if you're looking to have those slides, we will make them available. I know all of the panelists after today would be happy to entertain any questions you all might have. We did provide within the slides contact information for AJ, Todd, Stefan, and Jim. So if you do have any follow-up questions, or if you start heading down a discussion point internally with maybe management and want to follow up on some of these topics, I know all of our experts would certainly be happy to handle any of those questions in the future as well. So with that, I am not seeing any other questions coming in. Feel free to reach out after the session. And we certainly thank you all for taking the time with us this morning. So thank you. And thank you, gentlemen, for your expertise and time and providing guidance on this rather complex topic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.